Tika the Enchantress, a Pale Ring short story. Written by Brian McKee.
Now do be careful on Underbridge, dear,
Tika's mother had said to her when she had been packing up her bags.
The big city can be a scary place. Don't talk to strangers, don't take food or coins from someone you don't know, and stay out of the back alleys. Stay close to Bradigan, and you do as he tells you, do you understand?
Little Tika had nodded her assent, clacking her beak repeatedly with excitement.
Yes, Mama. I will, Mama,
she had said, before allowing herself to be swept up in a warm, feathery embrace from her dearest mother. The two of them were Krauven. Resembling a cross between a human and a wingless crow, their bodies were covered in smooth, sleek black feathers that terminated around their ankles and wrists, revealing dark, almost obsidian black skin underneath. Each of their curving fingers and toes were tipped with hook-like black claws that, once upon a time, would have helped them cling to wood and stone. Wide tail feathers spread out from their lower backs, fanning out into a broad triangular shape. Sadly, they had no wings, and no feathers on their bodies could hope to keep them in the air.
Be good,
Tika's mother had whispered, giving her little girl a squeeze before pulling back. Her eyes, perfectly round and olive green, had shimmered with fresh tears that she did a magnificent job of holding back.
Promise me.
Tika nodded sharply.
I will, Mama. I promise.
Behind her, Bradigan had given the hugging birds a warm smile before reaching out to give Tika a friendly clap on the back with his thick dwarven hand. "Don't you worry your little head, miss," he had boomed in that warm voice of his, the sort that always reminded Tika of bellowing songs ringing out around a ceremonial campfire. "I'll take good of the little tyke for you. She's in good hands."
And when I come home, I'll be an enchantress,
Tika exclaimed, her mind alight with the possibilities. She thrust her hands up into the air, flexing her fingers wide open as if to simulate explosions.
Tika, the best enchantress there ever was!
Tika's mother had given the friendly dwarf a warm smile before handing Tika something.
Here, little beak,
she said. It was a doll, made of straw and bound in rough fabric. A wooden cone had been attached to the front of its face to serve as a beak, and two wings made of fabric were stitched to its sides. Tika ran her fingers over one of those wings, her mind suddenly longing for the sky. Her mother's smile stayed firm.
I know it isn't much, but just a little bit of home for you to keep close until it's time to come back.
Tika had given off a series of delighted chirps, hugging the doll close to her chest. She and her mother had shared one last nuzzle before, with that ever-warm smile, Bradigan ushered her silently out of her small village hut. That had been 3 years ago. And now, here she was, sitting on the front steps of Bradigan's workshop in the great city of Underbridge, the doll resting against her hip, and a thick leather-bound book sprawled open in her lap. The years had not been kind to the doll, especially given that it was Tika playing with it. Her claws had left scratches and rips in the fabric in many places, ugly eyesores that reminded her that such toys are more often the property of humans and dwarves. Time had been far kinder to her than her toy, however. She had grown considerably in that time, and was now almost as tall as a full-grown dwarf, coming in at just under 4 feet. Her feathers were kept meticulously clean, smooth, and sleek, while her claws shined with simple but effective nail polish. She wore a blue shirt and a long green skirt. And all around her was the lively chatter of ordinary men and women going about their business. She idly flicked her gaze up to watch them, taking in all of the vibrant colors of the old human city. She gazed upon a beautiful, wide-open plaza in Underbridge's beating heart, surrounded on all sides by towering structures made of creamy, off-white stone bricks, capped with shingles of ocean blues or fiery reds. A monolithic castle loomed over it all far to the north, while the spires of the Arcanian assemblage rose to pierce the heavens in the south. She could see market stalls at the far end of the plaza, where merchants hawked their goods to passers-by with practiced voices and rehearsed slogans. Wagons pulled by horses went rattling by, and lively music sounded out from a small band of entertainers on the prowl for a quick donation. It was all a jumble of chaos and noise that you would never find in Tika's cozy little hometown out in the grasslands. And she loved it. She had been intimidating on first arriving. The Krauven did not tend to build their homes so large or so close together. She had felt stifled, almost threatened by the sheer scale of the place and the chaotic energy that filled it. But now? The frantic pace of the city meant she never had the opportunity to become bored. There was always something to do, something to watch, someone to talk to, some errand to run. Tika found herself humming along to the tune of the bards as she read through her book. It was a dictionary of sorts, illustrating in exacting detail the various runes and symbols that were used in the art of enchanting. Each one was annotated with words written in the common tongue, describing the definitions and functions of each rune. Tika's legs kicked idly beneath her, swinging to and fro in harmony with the steady thumping rhythm of the song's drumbeat as she read. Behind her rose her home of 3 years, and would continue to be her home for 5 more. Bradigan's workshop was, in a single word, majestic. The front-facing exterior of the enchanter's workplace rose higher than any of the other structures of the plaza, the double-door entranceway framed on either side by towering windows that reached up to a high, smooth archway. Supporting pillars were on either side, propping up the ceiling and framing each window in a manner that implied more significance than they truly held. Above the doorway, a circular window of stained glass depicted a dwarven man hammering at an anvil, surrounded by blue flames and purple swirls. A custom order Bradigan had made long before Tika had ever begun her tenure as his apprentice. And above it all, high up beyond the edge of the sky, shining constantly in sun or starlight, was the pale ring. Tika didn't know much about it, only that the pale ring was comprised of countless chunks of glowing rock that drifted in an endless loop around their world. It was the source of all of Aris's magic. Sometimes pieces of the ring would fall to Aris, and it was those fallen ring stones that served as the foundation of most Magi's spells and the building block of all enchantments. She was abruptly pulled out of her musings when she caught sight of someone approaching the workshop. Her eyes lit up with delight, and her cheeks lifted in the Krauven equivalent of a smile when she saw that it was another of her own kind. He was an adult and draped in the telltale green robes of the assemblage. Tika immediately thumped her book closed and stood up to greet the other birdman.
Oh, hello, hi,
she said emphatically, waving at him as he approached. The man's slanted brown eyes looked up at Tika in surprise, but a moment later his beak gave a sharp clack of happiness, and Tika beamed at the familiar sound. He stepped closer to her, matching her smile. "Well, hello there, young one," he greeted in a smooth, refined voice. "What are you doing here?" His eyes then landed on the dictionary held close to Tika's chest, and his eyes flickered with dawning comprehension. "Ah, I see." He chuckled. "I did not realize that Bradigan's apprentice was a Krauven." Tika's smile grew so wide it made her cheeks hurt.
I'm Tika,
she greeted, holding out a hand.
What's your name?
A handful of people gave Tika and the mage confused looks, no doubt surprised by the candid manner of Tika's approach to speaking with someone from the assemblage. The older Krauven did not seem to mind, however, as he reached out to shake Tika's hand. "I'm Jetta, a tuner apprentice at the Arcanian assemblage. I'm in my 4th year." He identified himself in the Krauven's native language, a series of trills, chirps, clicks, and sharp whistles. "How long have you been studying?" Have you managed to create anything yourself yet? Hearing the familiar language made Tika gasp with joy, and she was suddenly hit with a wave of nostalgia. If she had had more strength in her arms, she might have torn Jedda's off with how vigorously she shook his hand. Even once she released him, she was barely able to contain her joyful jitters. When she spoke, it was in the same language.
No, Brad won't let me try enchanting anything yet. I've been studying for 3 years, though. I'm learning the runes right now.
So I see, Jeddah said, his eyes flicking down to the dictionary. His smile widened. Keep up your studies, little one. Maybe one day, when you are a master enchantress yourself, we will have the chance to collaborate. Tika nodded emphatically.
I would like that very much.
To the uninitiated, the two of them speaking together could be mistaken for the discourse of songbirds, and some few people paused in the streets to affix the duo with expressions of charm, rather than surprise. A moment later, Jeddah folded his hands behind his back. It is a delight to meet you, young Tika. However, I am here on business. Is Bradigan in? He asked, once more speaking in the common tongue. The doors suddenly swung open, and Bradigan himself came walking out. Right here, he greeted, lifting up one of his hands. Tika turned to him and giggled when she saw that his beard still had leftover crumbs from his lunch scattered throughout. Bradigan noticed her giggle, recognized the meaning, and swiftly swept a hand down his beard to clear the crumbs away mid-stride. Jeddah circled around Tika, advancing up the steps to meet with Bradigan at their summit. It is good to meet you, Bradigan. I am Jetta Berkmont, a Tuna student. I heard. Bradigan cut him off with a warm smile. You were coming up right as my lunch break was over. Heard the whole chat. Jetta chuckled, and Tika couldn't help but let out a little squeal as the taller birdman gave her a large grin. Bradigan laughed at the sound. By the looks of it, Tika likes you.
He's a Krauven!
Tika piped up with a little hop.
There aren't a lot of those in this city. It's exciting!
Jetta's grin widened. The feeling is mutual, he remarked softly, his eyes landing on the little doll that Tika had scooped up to join the book against her chest. A twinkle came to his eyes then. Tika's own flew wide with awe when Jetta reached into a pocket in his robes and withdrew a smoothed-down shard of softly glowing white stone.
A ring stone!
She blurted automatically.
You have a ring stone?
Jetta clacked his beak. Of course I do. If I'm to attune to the ring itself, then I must first understand how magic works. For example, Tika blinked when Jetta suddenly spoke in a language that she did not recognize. She let off a quiet trill of confusion that evolved into a squeal of delight as the doll in her hand suddenly began to flap its little wings. She released her hold on it and watched, wide-eyed and jumping in place, as the stuffed toy took to the air, flying in circles around her. Bradigan laughed again. Oh, thank you for that, Jetta. Now she's gonna be gushing about you for months, he said in mock disdain. Jetta turned back to the enchanter. I fail to see the problem with getting my legend started in the delight of a child.
It's flying!
Tika screamed the obvious, clawing at the air after her doll. Bradigan rolled his eyes. Yeah, fair point, I suppose. Now, what can I do for you? You didn't come down here to my humble little workshop just to make my apprentice swoon. Jetta's expression hardened considerably, though Tika was not really paying attention. Her attention was fixed solely on the flying doll, her little hands balled up into fists under her chin. She was once again vividly remembering stories her mother had once told her of how the Krauven had been the lords of the skies in ages past. The luxury of flight had been taken from the birdfolk a long, long time ago, but that didn't stop them from remembering the legends and dreaming of reclaiming those glory days for themselves. Slowly, the doll began to lose energy as the simple spell played itself out. Tika held out her hands and smiled softly as the doll came to a gentle landing in her cupped palms. The wings twitched a couple of times, before it fell still. "Oi, Tika!" Bradigan called over to her, startling her out of her reverie. She looked up to see Jetta walking away, and Bradigan heading back inside the workshop with an ornate wooden lockbox tucked under his arm. "Come on, we got ourselves a commission!" Tika's eyes lit up with delight as she gave chase.
Ooh, that means we get to enchant something!
She squawked, a little of her natural avian chirp slipping into her voice.
What is it? What is it?
Bradigan issued a bellowing laugh in response to Tika's excitement. He reached over and ruffled the feathers on her head, making her squawk in protest. He held up the lockbox in his other hand. "This? Jetta says he wants us to make it so it won't open for anyone but him. Make it a safe place for him to keep his ringstone." Tika blinked, her head twitching to one side in a curious tilt.
Oh, so not a sword?
Bradigan grinned. "Not every magical thing has to do with slaying monsters, you know," he told her. With that, he turned and shouldered the door open. The front room was a simple affair, with a polished wooden desk where prospective customers came to discuss commissions. 2 doors were set into the back wall. One led to the living areas of the building, while the other led into a long corridor that would take them to the enchanting room. Tika huffed.
Well, no. But those things are always the best, because then you get to hear about them and those people go on to do cool things,
she reasoned.
Everyone talks about Richard's Spear of Annihilation, but no one talks about Jetta's picky box.
Bradigan rolled his eyes as he started for the enchanting room. "Oh, Jetta will. Jetta's friends will." Tika threw her arms up for emphasis.
But will a bard sing songs about Jetta's box?
Bradigan grinned. "Maybe if I toss them a few coins, they will." Tika puffed up indignantly, her feathers ruffling in dismay.
That doesn't count, that's bribery!
"No, it's a commission," Bradigan countered.
A commission is just a nice word for a bribe.
Any further words Tika might have offered in protest were summarily silenced when Bradigan's large finger pressed firmly to the tip of her beak. She went cross-eyed, and a tiny confused whistle slipped past her beak. She hated it when he did that. Bradigan laughed again. They were almost at the door to the workshop. "And we can discuss that worldview another time. For now..." He went silent as he stepped into the room where the magic happened. Tika looked up and around at it all, her eyes flying wide. No matter how many times she came back here, it never ceased to amaze her. The ceiling was high, and the walls were lined with rows upon rows of square-shaped cubbies, each one filled with supplies necessary for the trade. Abrasives, reagents, corrosives, scrolls, tools, and boxes filled to the brim with ringstones of all shapes and sizes. In the center of the monolithic chamber was a large, squat metal table that bore a vague resemblance to a very wide anvil. Bradigan's tone turned serious. "We have work to do." Tika nodded. The time for them to joke was over. They were on the clock now. The two came to a stop by the table as Bradigan set the box down. He looked it over curiously, rubbing at his chin. Tika waited beside him patiently, eagerly expecting the first instruction. As she waited, however, her thoughts began to drift back to Jetta. Her smile faded, and her gaze lowered slightly. It suddenly dawned on her that she hadn't even said goodbye to the friendly Krauven. She felt a sudden wave of guilt, and a tiny grimace marred her face. He had been so nice to her. He'd even made her doll fly. She held the toy up in her claws, looking it over. Seeing some stuffing leaking out of one of the rips, she idly poked it back inside where it belonged. His voice echoed in her head. "Keep up your studies, little one. Maybe one day, when you are a master enchantress yourself, we will have a chance to collaborate."
Brad?
Tika asked abruptly. The dwarf looked down at her as he fastened his gold-rimmed monocle over his eye. "What is it?" he asked. Tika shifted on her feet, folding her hands behind her back.
before you start teaching me how to actually enchant?
She asked hopefully.
So far it's all just been history and runes and stuff.
Bradigan paused for a moment before returning his gaze to the box in his hands. Enchanting isn't all fun and games, Tika. It's nothing like drawing a picture or writing a funny note, he said, repeating a phrase she had heard many times from him now. There are consequences for doing it wrong. The runes need to be exact, the tools have to be right, and the seals need to be perfect. To try and enchant something before you understand what you're doing can have disastrous consequences. People can get hurt.
I know,
Tika shot back, her cheeks puffing up again.
But I've been studying all these things for 3 years already. Can't you at least show me something simple?
Bradigan took a slow breath, his eyes again looking at Tika and giving her a thorough examination. A moment later, he released his breath in a sigh. Even a simple enchantment can go horrendously wrong, he told her. I'm not trying to hold you back or coddle you. I'm just trying to make sure you're going to be safe in my care. I promised your mother I'd look after you, and I'll be damned if I go back on that promise by being careless.
But
I'll teach you when you're ready, Bradigan stated with firm finality. But you still have a lot to learn. Now we can talk about this later, okay? For now, we have work to do, so let's focus up, huh? Tika wanted to continue and argue her point, but she knew that Brad had a point himself. Right now was not the time for this discussion. They had work to do. And so, with a little nod, she dropped the subject and turned her attention back down to the box.
All right, let's do it.
Bradigan smiled and gave her a loving pat on the head. Atta girl. Now, I'm gonna need 2 chisels, one for wood, one for stone, a few sheets of sandpaper, varying coarseness. Gonna need some wood polish. Bring me a ringstone slab, about 4 inches. Fetch me those and the dictionary. Tika gave a sharp nod and hopped to work. The next several hours were defined by this. A part of Tika's tutelage under Bradigan meant serving as his assistant as he worked, fetching tools and supplies when he needed them, consulting the scrolls and dictionaries for the right runes when he couldn't look himself, helping to hold things still when he went to work with his chisels, and carefully removing any debris from the table so it didn't get in the way or contaminate the substances. And all the while, she was to pay very close attention to every step Bradigan took, every tiny detail. An enchanter had to know them all by memory, and it was not a short process. It was tiring, taxing, and so involved that there was no longer room for idle chatter. But even so, even in her position as the assistant, Tika found it fulfilling. The act of taking something mundane and imbuing it with magic mesmerized and amazed her, and if she had any say in the matter, she would be the best enchantress there ever was one day. That day was not today, sadly. Still, she couldn't help but dream. Tika did not think much more about the visit from Jeddah or the discussion she had with Bradigan afterward. The whirlwind of activity and the steady pace of her tutelage left her with precious little time to give such matters any attention. She had to focus on her lessons in math, carpentry, stone sculpting, language, and so many other things. All of these skills were, according to Brad, essential for an enchanter. But between the lessons and the enchanting, in those fleeting moments of peaceful silence, Tika did find time to let her thoughts wander. And wander they did, like the birds soaring through the sky. One such moment, a couple of days after Jeddah had come to see them, Tika found herself once again on her lunch break. This time, however, she was sitting at the dining room table in the living area of the building. Once again, she had her beak shoved into the pages of her dictionary, going over more runes. Every so often, her hand would reach over to a bowl of assorted berries and pop a few into her beak. Tika, need to head out for a bit, Bradigan's voice suddenly called out from the doorway, drawing Tika's attention. She looked up to see the dwarf with a warm smile on his face. Need to drop off Jetta's commission. I'll be back in a little bit, so mind the shop, would you? Tika tilted her head in confusion, about to close her book.
Huh? I'm not coming?
She asked, surprised. On a normal day, she would either be accompanying Bradigan for such a delivery, or she would be the one to deliver it herself. Not today, though, it would seem, as Brad firmly shook his head. Nah, sorry, kiddo. The assemblage is not in the habit of letting anyone onto the campus if they don't have business there, and you being my apprentice ain't gonna be reason enough for those stiffbacks. Besides, I need to make sure someone's here to keep an eye on the store and make sure no troublemakers rob the place, yeah? Tika nodded, unable to refute the logic. Her smile returned, wide and beaming, and she stood up in her seat.
Okay, take care, Brad,
she called after him, waving enthusiastically as he left the doorway. He waved back at her over his shoulder, but did not say anything else. Tika listened, and soon heard the telltale clunk and rattle of the workshop's front door opening and closing, followed by the click of the lock. At that moment, Tika was left alone.
No biggie,
she told herself, plonking back down into her seat to get back to her book.
Just means a longer lunch break for me.
In truth, there were other tasks she could be undertaking right now. But they were trivial, menial things. Cleaning counters, cleaning and polishing the tools, sorting the ringstones, checking the locks, and an assortment of other mundane tasks that would be marginally helpful in the day-to-day operations of the store. But Tika was a child, and she had a book to read. She turned to the next page, idly slipping a berry into her beak as she read on. Another long list of runes, their shapes exactly measured and proportioned, annotated with instructions and commentary. She went through them one at a time, idly tracing their shapes in the air with a finger as she went. She paused halfway down the second page, her eyes latching onto the second-to-last rune. Iza was its name. A symbol of an upward-pointing triangle with curving shapes sloping elegantly off of its sides like wings. These wings curved down to meet at the bottom, forming an oblong circle with another perfect circle contained within. The direct translation of the rune was fly. All at once, Tika's mind was brought back to her encounter with Jetta, and how he had made her doll dance and fly through the air like a sprightly dove. She felt a yearning then, a powerful desire to see that wonderful moment recreated, and she found that she could no longer focus on her book.
Iza,
she whispered to herself softly.
Fly. To take flight.
Her hand drifted down to her pocket, where the little doll was kept safe and sound. A moment later, Tika's smile returned, for she had just gotten an idea. Surely it was a terrible idea, but Tika was a mere child, one with dreams that as of yet went a little beyond her progress. But since when did that ever stop a child with an impulse? One could argue that good discipline from her guardian would have done the trick, but Bradigan was a tender, soft-hearted loaf of a man, and for all of his concerns and firmly worded warnings about the risks of sloppy enchantment, Tika had never once felt intimidated by him. And so, deciding that one little rune couldn't possibly be all that bad, Tika took up her doll and her dictionary and ran for the workstation in the back of the building. Surely this could only end well.